The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Wyoming territory into a fading glow. The air was thick with the smell of dust and the quiet hum of the prairie. Eliza Hartwell sat alone on the hard-packed earth beside her wagon. A shattered wheel sprawled before her like a broken promise. It had been a long journey from St. Louis, and the weight of her past seemed to hang over her like a storm cloud, always just out of reach, but never quite disappearing. She was running, but not from anything she could outrun. Her hands shook as she tried to fix the wheel again, her muscles sore from days of travel. The prairie stretched endlessly around her, with nothing but the faint echo of wolves in the distance and the soft rustle of wind through the sagebrush. She had no bullets left, but she kept the rifle close, its wood smooth under her palm. Her mind kept returning to the man she had fled, Charles Hartwell, a man who had thought he owned her. The memory of his harsh words and cold eyes still clung to her like a shadow. She was free now, but the cost had been steep. Every mile west was another step further from him, but also from everything she knew. Nightfall came quickly, the temperature dropping as the stars began to twinkle above. Eliza wrapped herself in the worn blanket she had carried from St. Louis, pulling it tight around her shoulders. She settled beside the broken wagon, knowing there was nothing more she could do. She wasn't sure she would make it through the night, but she had no other choice. The howling wolves only reminded her that survival wasn't certain. She closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the night. It was all she could do now. From the distant ridge, Miles Thornton watched her, his dark eyes narrowing as he studied her with quiet intensity. He had passed dozens of broken wagons in his time, but something about this one caught his attention. Most of the people he came across were either too proud or too desperate to ask for help. But this woman, she wasn't giving up. She was trying to fix the wheel herself, stubborn and determined. Miles knew what it was like to be alone on the prairie. He had built the Thornton Cattle Company from the ground up, and he learned quickly that the land didn't care about your dreams or your troubles. It took everything from you, and in return, it offered only silence. Dutch, his ranch foreman, rode up beside him on his horse, watching the woman from the ridge with curiosity. "Boss, that woman's gonna freeze to death out there. She's all alone." Miles didn't answer right away. He was still watching her, weighing his options. "I know. You gonna help her?" Dutch asked, his voice laced with concern. Miles paused, thinking. He had seen his share of desperate souls on the prairie, and most of them had been beyond saving. But something about this one was different. There was a fierceness in her that he respected, something raw and untamed. He finally spoke, his voice low. "Haven't decided yet." The ranch was his world, and he had built it with sweat, blood, and years of hard work. People knew his name, and they knew what kind of man he was. But what they didn't know was how lonely it had become, how many nights he had spent staring at the empty space beside him in his bed. Women came and went, but they always wanted something he couldn't give. They wanted his wealth, his land, his power. No one ever seemed to care about him. The woman on the prairie, though, didn't seem interested in any of that. She wasn't asking for help, but rather, she was fighting to survive on her own terms. That was something he understood. He nudged his horse forward, making his decision. "I'll help her, but not as Miles Thornton, the man who owns half this territory." He glanced at Dutch, who gave a small nod of understanding. "I'll go to her as just a cowboy." As dawn's first light broke over the horizon, Eliza stirred from her fitful sleep. The night had been long, the cold seeping into her bones. She heard the soft clip-clop of hooves approaching and, instinctively, her hand reached for the rifle. She wasn't sure who was coming, but she knew better than to trust anyone out here. Her eyes squinted into the pale morning light as a figure on horseback came into view. He was tall, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the rising sun. He wore a weathered hat, a brown coat, and leather chaps. His face was rough, the kind of face that belonged to a man who had spent his life in the open, where the land did all the talking and a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands. "Easy," the man said, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not here to hurt you." Eliza didn't lower the rifle. "Then what do you want?" Her voice was sharp, defensive, a habit she had learned from years of being at the mercy of others. She wasn't about to trust anyone again. He glanced down at the broken wheel, then back at her. "You've got two choices. You can stay out here and freeze to death, or you can let me help you get to town." Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to keep fighting on her own. But the thought of sitting here in the cold, waiting for death to find her, made her heart race. She was exhausted, too tired to fight anymore. "I can't pay you," she said, finally lowering the rifle just a fraction. The man shrugged, his eyes unreadable. "I didn't ask you to." He nodded toward the horse. "Come on, let's get you to safety." Reluctantly, Eliza grabbed her few belongings and climbed onto the horse behind him. As they rode toward the horizon, she had no idea who this man really was or why he had chosen to help her. All she knew was that he was offering her a chance to survive. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could escape the past that had chased her all the way to the edge of this wild land. As they rode, the man silently signaled to another rider in the distance. Eliza didn't notice, but the wagon, still stranded by the side of the road, would soon be taken care of. The man's world was far bigger than the one she knew, and she was just beginning to realize that this was only the beginning of her new life. She had no idea that the man behind her could buy and sell this entire territory twice over. And he had no idea that the woman clinging to his waist was running from a danger that money couldn't stop. As they rode toward the horizon, Eliza had no idea she was sitting behind a man who could buy and sell the entire territory twice over. And Miles? He had no idea the woman clutching his waist was running from a danger that money couldn't stop. As they rode through the vast, sun-drenched prairie, Eliza's mind raced, the rhythm of the horse's hooves against the earth both soothing and unsettling. She had heard whispers of Thornton Creek, a place where men built fortunes and ran cattle. But she hadn't expected it to feel so distant from the desperation she had left behind. Miles' presence was calm, steady, but his silence made her uneasy. She wanted to ask him questions about the land, about the town, about why he was helping her. But every time she opened her mouth, the words seemed to slip away like dust on the wind. The horse moved smoothly beneath them, its steady pace a contrast to the chaos in her mind. "Running from something, or towards something?" Miles asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. She turned her face slightly toward him, but didn't answer right away. "Doesn't matter," she replied, her voice low, as if the question itself carried too much weight. The wind tugged at her hair as she glanced back over her shoulder at the endless stretch of land behind them. She had been running for so long, she wasn't sure what it would mean to stop. "Out here," Miles continued, his tone not unkind. "No, fresh starts don't ask questions." Eliza nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in her chest. They didn't stop riding until the sun was high in the sky, the heat of midday pressing down on them. Miles didn't speak much, but there was an ease about him that calmed her, even as the edges of her past gnawed at the back of her mind. She wondered, briefly, if he could tell she was hiding something, but then he spoke again, offering her a chance for something new, something she hadn't expected. "There's always work for capable hands in Thorn Creek," he said. "What kind of work?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "Whatever you're good at. I've seen plenty of people make their way here with little more than a skill and a good work ethic." Eliza didn't know whether to take comfort in his words or to remain cautious. She glanced at him, wondering if he was just being kind or if he truly saw something in her. Either way, there was something about him that felt different from everyone else she had met. As the miles stretched on, she began to relax, letting the rhythm of the ride ease the tension in her body. She couldn't yet trust him, couldn't trust anyone, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was moving toward something that wasn't a dead end. Hours passed, and the land around them began to change. The flat, endless plains gave way to rolling hills and clusters of trees. Soon, a sprawling estate came into view, an unexpected oasis in the middle of the wilderness. The sight took her by surprise. "This is someone's ranch?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It is," Miles replied, his tone matter of fact. They rode through enormous wrought iron gates that marked the entrance to the Thornton Ranch. Eliza was too stunned to speak, taking in the sight of the sprawling property. Fields of grazing cattle, rows of barns and corrals, and a stately Victorian mansion that loomed ahead. "You're the boss of all this?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Miles didn't respond immediately, but when they reached the front of the ranch house, he dismounted, helped her down, and met her gaze. "I own it," he said simply. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She had assumed he was just a cowboy, a man of little consequence, but now everything had shifted. Her mind raced as she took in the full scale of what he had built. This was no ordinary ranch. It was a kingdom of sorts, a world unto itself. And she had just ridden into it, a stranger with nothing but the clothes on her back and a past she couldn't escape. The reality of it hit her all at once, and she stepped back, her mind spinning. "You lied to me," she said, her voice sharp with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. Miles' face remained impassive. "I didn't lie. I just didn't correct your assumption," he replied, his gaze steady. Eliza wanted to shout at him, to demand answers, but she held back. She had already been fooled once by a man who had promised her a life she could never have. She wasn't sure she could survive another betrayal, even if this one came in the form of an unexpected kindness. But Miles didn't press her. Instead, he turned, motioning for her to follow him toward the large ranch house. "You're here now," he said, his voice low and steady, "and I need someone to help run this place." Eliza's mind raced as she followed him, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had come west to escape, to find a fresh start, but now she was standing in the heart of a man's empire. She couldn't be sure what his intentions were, but the offer to stay, to work for him, seemed like the only choice she had. But what would she be giving up in the process? And why had he chosen to help her in the first place? Her questions hung in the air, unanswered, as they entered the house together. The vast hallways, the high ceilings, and the cold marble floors were a far cry from the dusty, broken world she had left behind. But even as she marveled at the beauty of it all, a deep unease settled in her chest. Something told her that this was only the beginning of a much bigger story, a story she wasn't sure she was ready to be a part of. Miles led her through the house, showing her the rooms, the kitchen, the dining area. Everything was grand, polished, and spotless. The air smelled of fresh wood and leather, and Eliza felt like an intruder in a world that didn't belong to her. Miles stopped in front of a door at the end of a long hallway. "This will be your room," he said, his voice still calm, but there was a certain finality in it. She looked at the door, her heart pounding. This was real. This was happening. "I don't want charity," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This isn't charity," Miles replied, his tone firm. "This is an offer. You can stay as long as you need. You work for me, and I'll make sure you're taken care of." Eliza swallowed hard, her thoughts swirling. She didn't trust him, but she had no choice. She couldn't survive out here on her own. She had no idea what kind of man he was, but at least he wasn't asking for anything in return. Not yet. She stepped inside the room, her mind still racing with questions. What was she walking into? What had she really agreed to? Miles stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. "Take your time. I'll have someone bring your things over from the wagon," he said before turning to leave. As the door closed behind her, Eliza stood in silence, feeling the weight of her decision press down on her. She had no answers, no guarantees. But for the first time since she had left St. Louis, she had a roof over her head. And that, for now, would have to be enough. Miles showed her to the foreman's old cabin, small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace and a real bed. As Eliza bolted the door behind him, she pressed her back against it and whispered a prayer. She'd escaped one wealthy man's control. She couldn't afford to walk into another's trap. But outside, Miles stood on his porch, watching the cabin's chimney smoke curl into the sky, and wondered why this stranger felt like the answer to a question he'd been too afraid to ask. The first week in Thornton Ranch passed in a blur, each day blending into the next, a mix of hard work and quiet moments of reflection. Eliza threw herself into her duties, transforming the chaotic, cluttered house into something orderly and efficient. The kitchen, once a disorganized mess, was now clean and well-stocked, with everything in its place. She organized the pantry, keeping careful track of supplies, and even developed a system for the house's inventory, something Miles hadn't even thought to do before. The ranch hands, who had once seemed indifferent to the disarray, began to notice the change. "Boss," one of them said with a grin, "the house hasn't run this smooth in years. You got yourself a real treasure here." Eliza's cheeks flushed at the praise, though she tried to hide it behind her usual wall of caution. She didn't want to get too comfortable, didn't want to believe that this new life might actually work. There was still too much she didn't know, too many questions left unanswered. But each day she spent at the ranch, she felt a little more at ease. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe, and for the first time in a long time, safety felt like something she could hold on to. As the week went on, Miles kept his distance, never pressing her for more than what she was willing to give. He was always polite, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes, a sense that he was watching her, studying her. Eliza didn't know what he saw, but she felt it, his eyes following her when she moved about the house, his gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary. She could never shake the feeling that he was waiting for something, expecting something from her, but he never said what it was. One evening, after the sun had set and the workday was done, Miles left the ranch house in a hurry, his expression tight with something she couldn't read. The sound of his horse's hooves faded into the distance, leaving Eliza in the quiet of the house, surrounded by the warm glow of the fire and the soft crackle of wood burning. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity and need to know where he was going, what he was doing. But she pushed the thought away. It wasn't her business. That's what she kept telling herself. This was just a job, a place to stay. She wasn't here to get involved in his life, in his secrets. The next morning, as she was cleaning the study, a ledger caught her eye, left open on the desk where Miles had been sitting the night before. Curiosity tugged at her, and before she could stop herself, she glanced at the pages, the numbers jumping out at her. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed something strange. Discrepancies in the accounts, small amounts of money missing here and there, but always in a pattern. The more she looked, the more it became clear. Someone was stealing from Miles. The amounts weren't huge, but over time, they added up to something significant. Eliza's heart raced as she absorbed the information. It wasn't her place to get involved in this, but she knew what she had to do. She couldn't let someone take advantage of him, not when he had been nothing but kind to her. That evening, when Miles returned, she waited for him in the study, the ledgers in her hands. He didn't look surprised to see her there. "Eliza," he said, his voice low, "what's wrong?" "I think your bookkeeper is stealing from you," she said, her voice steady despite the tension rising in her chest. Miles raised an eyebrow, but he didn't brush her off. "How do you know?" he asked. She laid the ledgers on the desk in front of him, pointing out the discrepancies. As she spoke, his expression shifted from curiosity to concern, and then to something else, something colder. He studied the numbers, his jaw tightening as he absorbed what she had uncovered. "You're right," he said finally, his voice tight with frustration. "I'll take care of it." Eliza stood back, watching him, unsure of what to say next. He hadn't asked her where she had learned to read books like this, or why she had noticed the pattern. She had simply acted because it was the right thing to do. But Miles, to her surprise, didn't question her further. Instead, he thanked her, his voice softer than before, and dismissed her to finish her work. As she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had changed something between them. But what? Later that evening, after dinner, Miles asked her to join him for a ride to town the next morning. "I've got some business to take care of," he said, his tone casual, but there was an edge to it. Eliza agreed without thinking much of it. But as the days passed, she began to realize that this wasn't a simple trip to town. She had seen how people treated him when they visited Thornton Creek. The store owners, the mayor, even the cattle drivers, they all deferred to him as if he were royalty. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that Miles wasn't just a rancher. He was the power in this territory. When they arrived in town the next morning, Eliza was struck by how familiar everyone seemed with him. The shopkeepers called him by name, greeted him with respect, and practically begged for his business. He paid no more than a casual glance at them, as if this kind of treatment was routine. But Eliza couldn't ignore it. She was finally beginning to see the full extent of his wealth and influence. He wasn't just a man with a ranch, he was a man who controlled everything in this territory. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just a stranger in his world. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand. As they returned to the ranch, Miles seemed different, distant, his mood dark. The light in his eyes that had once been so warm now seemed clouded with thoughts he wasn't sharing. She wanted to ask him what was wrong, but a part of her hesitated. Something told her that if she dug too deep, she might not like the answers. "My brother's coming to visit," Miles said after a long silence. Eliza looked at him sharply. "Your brother?" she repeated, trying to make sense of this new piece of information. "Carter thinks I owe him half of everything." "I don't," he added, his voice tight. Eliza didn't push further, though her curiosity flared. There was something Miles wasn't saying. Later, as they sat around the fire that night, she pressed him gently for more information. He told her about his father, how he had gambled away the family's wealth and left them in ruins. "I had to build everything from nothing," he said, his voice low. "Carter squandered his inheritance, and now he wants what I've earned. I don't owe him anything." Eliza, for the first time, saw the weight of Miles's struggle. She had always assumed he was a man of privilege, born into power, but now she understood that he had fought for every inch of what he had. It wasn't handed to him, he had earned it. But what Eliza didn't know was that Carter wasn't the only one who had a claim on Miles's life. She hadn't told him everything, not yet. She hadn't told him about Charles Hartwell, the man she had fled, and she wasn't sure she ever would. That night, as Eliza lay in bed, she wondered how long it would take before her secrets caught up to her. And what would Miles do when he found out the truth? She couldn't let herself trust him completely, not yet. But the more time she spent with him, the harder it became to keep her guard up. Carter Thornton arrives, handsome, charming, reckless energy. Immediately flirts with Eliza, makes her uncomfortable. Carter to Miles, "Brother, you always did have excellent taste. Where do you find this beauty?" Miles cold, "She's my housekeeper. Leave her alone." Dinner that night. Carter drinks heavily. The storm hit hard that night, the sky blackening with thick clouds that rumbled and crackled with every gust of wind. Eliza had always feared thunderstorms, a fear rooted deep in her past, one she had never quite shaken. She had learned to hide it well, to swallow the panic that surged in her chest when the wind howled and the thunder shook the very earth beneath her feet. But tonight, as the winds howled and the rain beat against the windows, all her carefully built walls began to crumble. She couldn't stop the trembling that overtook her body, couldn't keep the tears from welling up in her eyes as the thunder rumbled like a wild animal clawing at the earth. She grabbed the blanket off her bed, wrapping herself in it, but it didn't help. Her heart raced, her breath quickened, and the panic threatened to swallow her whole. She had to get out, had to move, had to do something. Without thinking, she ran from the cabin, her bare feet slapping against the muddy ground as she made her way toward the main house. She didn't even know what she was doing, only that she had to escape the noise, the fear, the memories that swirled around her like ghosts. When Miles found her standing on the porch, soaking wet and shaking uncontrollably, his first instinct was to pull her inside, away from the storm. "Eliza," he said gently, his voice laced with concern. "What happened?" She couldn't speak. The storm raged louder in her mind, drowning out everything else. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it didn't help. Miles didn't push her to answer right away. Instead, he wrapped her in a thick blanket, his hands warm against her cold skin. He sat with her in front of the fire, holding her close, letting the warmth of his body calm her as the storm continued to rage outside. She felt safe with him in a way she hadn't felt with anyone in years. His presence was a steady anchor in the chaos of her mind. Slowly, her breathing returned to normal, the fear loosening its grip on her heart. She leaned back against him, feeling the weight of her exhaustion settle in. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what happened." Miles didn't say anything at first, just kept his arm around her, his fingers gently rubbing her shoulder. After a long silence, he spoke. "You don't have to explain, Eliza. I'm here." His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of something else in it, a tenderness that she hadn't expected, something deeper than the simple kindness he had shown her since she arrived at the ranch. She didn't know how to respond, so she said nothing, just let the silence stretch between them. And then, without thinking, the words spilled out of her. "I'm not who you think I am," she whispered. Miles stiffened beside her, his grip tightening on her shoulder. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. Eliza hesitated, but the storm inside her seemed to drive the words out, unbidden. "My real name is Elizabeth Hartwell," she said, the confession hanging heavy in the air. "I was married to Charles Hartwell, a banker in St. Louis. My father's business partner arranged the marriage. I was only 18. He was controlling, possessive, and he was violent." She paused, the weight of her past threatening to crush her. "I don't want to remember it," she whispered, her voice shaking. Miles didn't say anything at first. He just sat with her, his presence a quiet reassurance as the storm raged on. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold chill that had settled deep in her bones. "You don't have to," he said finally, his voice low, "but I'm glad you told me. You're safe here, Eliza. You don't have to run anymore." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Eliza's heart swell with something she couldn't name. She leaned back against him, her head resting against his chest as she let the comfort of his presence wash over her. She didn't know how long they sat there, but eventually the storm outside began to subside. The wind died down, and the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle. Miles was the first to break the silence. "If he comes here," he said quietly, "he'll answer to me." Eliza's heart skipped a beat, the protective fire in his words sending a shiver through her. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He has money, lawyers, connections. The law is on his side. He can make me go back." Miles didn't argue, didn't tell her it would be easy. Instead, he just held her, his arms tightening around her. "So do I," he said softly. "And out here, I am the law." The sincerity in his words struck her deep. She had never known a man who would protect her like this, not even from her own past. She had always been alone, always had to fight her own battles. But with Miles, it was different. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The weight of her confession hung between them, but it wasn't heavy anymore. Instead, it felt like a burden she had finally released, one that she had carried alone for far too long. The next day, the storm had passed, but the tension in the air remained. Eliza went about her duties as usual, trying to keep herself busy, trying not to think too much about the words she had spoken to Miles the night before. But it wasn't easy. The storm had shifted something inside her. It had made her realize how much she had been hiding from him, and how much she had been hiding from herself. Later that evening, after dinner, as they sat on the porch, Miles turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Carter's coming," he said, his voice tight. Eliza froze, her heart dropping into her stomach. "Carter," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "My brother," Miles said, his tone darkening. "He thinks I owe him half of everything I've built, but he doesn't." Eliza didn't know what to say. The last thing she wanted was to be caught up in some family feud, especially not with everything she had already been through. But before she could respond, Miles spoke again, his voice hardening. "He'll be here soon, and when he arrives, he'll learn that I'm not giving up a single thing." Eliza swallowed hard, her thoughts racing. She didn't know what this meant for her or for Miles. But one thing was clear: Carter's arrival was going to change everything. That night, as she lay in bed, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that her past was catching up to her, that the storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. And now, she had to face it head on. 3 days after their hasty, yet surprisingly intimate, marriage, the air at Thornton Ranch was thick with tension. Eliza had spent the morning working in the garden, trying to ground herself in the reality of her new life, but the nagging feeling of unease never quite left her. She had not expected things to change overnight, but the whirlwind of her past and present clashed every time she tried to move forward. As she stood in the quiet, early morning light, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves pounding against the dirt. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the harsh sunlight, and saw 2 riders approaching the house. One was a tall, impeccably dressed man with cold eyes and a practiced smile that seemed to radiate smug confidence. The other was a man in a uniform, something official, a federal marshal. Her heart sank as the weight of the moment pressed on her chest. It was Charles Hartwell, and with him a lawman. "Eliza," Miles said softly, appearing at her side, his face betraying none of the tension that had suddenly built between them. "Stay behind me," he instructed, his voice firm but calm. The storm of emotions swirling inside, Eliza threatened to overwhelm her. She had hoped, prayed, that her past was behind her, but it had followed her here, with her husband's promise of protection proving to be nothing more than a fragile shield against the man who had once controlled every part of her life. As they walked together toward the porch, Eliza's breath quickened, her legs heavy beneath her. Charles greeted her with his usual insincere charm, his smile tight as he locked eyes with her. "Elizabeth," he said with cold affection, his voice like ice. "This charade ends now. You're coming home with me." Eliza could feel the color drain from her face, her heart hammering in her chest. Miles, however, remained calm and collected, his body language unwavering as he stepped forward, placing himself firmly between her and Charles. "No," Miles said, his voice low and resolute. "She's not going anywhere." The marshal, a stern man with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude, stepped forward, holding up a legal document. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Eliza directly, "Mr. Hartwell has the legal documents to prove he is your husband. According to the law, you are still married to him." Eliza's eyes widened in disbelief as she glanced at the papers, a sinking feeling in her stomach. She hadn't expected this, not like this, not in the middle of a battle she thought was over. But Miles didn't flinch. "She's not his wife anymore," Miles said, his voice steady and firm. "She's my wife now, and she's not going anywhere with you." Charles laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that grated against Eliza's nerves. "You've got no claim on her," he sneered, his eyes flashing with malice. "You're just a cowboy, Miles. What makes you think you can stand up to me?" Miles' gaze never wavered. "Because this land is mine, and I don't take kindly to men who think they can push people around." Eliza couldn't help the tremor that ran through her body as she listened to their words, as they seemed to be fighting over her very identity. She had never felt more like a pawn in someone else's game. "You don't know the law," Charles said, his tone dripping with condescension. "She belongs to me. She always will. The words hit her like a slap, and she fought the urge to collapse under the weight of his cruelty. But then, as if the heavens had answered her prayers, Miles spoke again, his voice unwavering. She doesn't belong to anyone, Miles said firmly. Not anymore. She's free, and I'll protect her. Charles's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. You'll regret this, Miles. You'll regret standing in my way. He turned to the marshal, who reluctantly produced a warrant for her arrest, but Miles stepped forward, taking the document from the officer's hands with ease. This is nothing, Miles said coldly. You're out of your depth, Charles. The marshal looked uncomfortable as he realized the full scope of the situation. I'm just doing my job, he muttered, his face conflicted. You'll have to take it up with the courts. But Miles wasn't done. He turned to the ranch hands, who had gathered in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. Escort them off the property, he ordered, and make sure they know they're not welcome back. The ranch hands moved forward, their faces hard with resolve, and Charles knew he had lost. The marshal glanced at Eliza one last time, his eyes apologetic, before following Charles to the edge of the property. This isn't over, Elizabeth, Charles called over his shoulder as he walked away, but there was no conviction in his voice now. It was empty, hollow, like a man who had realized he was outmatched. Eliza stood frozen for a moment, her body trembling as the adrenaline faded. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and her knees felt weak. She had never expected to face Charles again, and yet here he was, a reminder of everything she had left behind. Miles' presence beside her was a steadying force, though his words were quiet, almost too calm. You're safe now, he said, his hand brushing her shoulder. Eliza nodded numbly, not trusting her voice. She wasn't sure what had just happened or what it meant, but she knew one thing for certain. She had never felt more vulnerable than she did at that moment. Charles had made his claim, but it didn't matter now. She wasn't his anymore. She belonged to herself. Miles was still standing beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back, as if offering silent support. She turned to him, her voice shaking as she spoke. Why did you do that for me? Miles didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her with an unreadable expression, his gaze intense. Because you deserve to be free, he said finally, and because I won't let anyone hurt you. The words struck something deep within her. She had never expected to hear them from anyone, least of all from a man like Miles. But there they were, a promise that felt real, a promise that spoke to the vulnerability she had been hiding for so long. Miles wasn't like the men she had known before. He wasn't interested in owning her or controlling her. He wanted to protect her, to give her the freedom she had been denied for so long. And for the first time in a long time, Eliza let herself believe it. But as they walked back toward the house, something else was weighing heavily on her heart. She had finally told Miles the truth about her past, about Charles, about everything she had run from. But what would happen if Miles ever learned about the things she had hidden? Would he still look at her the same way? Would he still want to protect her? Or would the truth push him away? The doubts gnawed at her, but for now, she let them go. Miles had stood by her, had defended her when she had thought she would be alone. And that was enough for now. That night, as she lay in bed, she tried to calm her racing thoughts, but a cold chill crept in. Charles might have left the ranch for now, but his threat still loomed. And Eliza knew that the hardest part of her journey was still ahead. After they leave, Eliza is quiet. Miles asks, "Did you take anything?" Eliza, "No, I swear on my life." Miles, "Then we change your legal status." Eliza, "What?" Miles, "Marry me." Eliza had never imagined that something as simple as a home could carry so much weight. In the weeks following Charles's confrontation, the tension at Thornton Ranch never quite lifted, lingering like the scent of a storm that had passed, but left behind a murky fog. The days grew longer, the work harder, but Miles had stayed by her side, unwavering in his support. He had done more than offer her protection. He had given her something she had never known before, a sense of belonging. For the first time in years, Eliza allowed herself to relax, to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find peace. The house on the hill that they were building together was a testament to their efforts. One brick at a time, one beam at a time, they were shaping something that felt real. Miles had been a steady presence, showing up every day to work beside her, laughing with her as they worked, sharing quiet moments as they planned out the future. But despite the peace she was beginning to feel, a shadow still loomed over them. Eliza couldn't forget what Charles had done, and she couldn't shake the fear that he would come back, that he would find some way to destroy everything Miles had built. The weight of her past, of her secrets, still sat heavily on her chest, and no matter how much Miles reassured her, she knew the truth. Charles would never stop coming for her. He had made that clear from the moment he arrived at Thorn Ranch. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Dutch, the ranch foreman, arrived with news that made Eliza's heart race. "Boss," Dutch said, his face grim, "we got a problem." Miles looked up from the papers he had been going over and stood, his eyes narrowing. Eliza could feel the shift in the air, the change in the atmosphere that came with news that wasn't good. "What's going on?" Miles asked. Dutch handed him a telegram, its corners crinkled from being in his pocket. "It's from the bank in St. Louis," Dutch said, his voice low. Miles read the telegram with a frown. "It's from Carter," he muttered, tossing the paper aside. "He's got a plan to take everything I've built." Eliza felt a cold chill run down her spine as she listened to Miles. She had known that Carter wasn't going to let go so easily, but the reality of it hit her like a blow to the gut. Miles had told her about his brother, about how Carter had squandered his inheritance and now wanted to take Miles' success, but Eliza hadn't fully grasped the depths of his determination until now. "What does he want?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miles's eyes hardened as he glanced at her. "He wants me to sell him the land. He thinks I'm just going to roll over and let him have it, but I'm not. I'll fight him to the end." Eliza knew the determination in his voice. It mirrored her own when she had fought to escape Charles. But this was different. Miles was not just fighting for his land. He was fighting for their future. The next few days passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Miles was never one to sit idly by when his family, or his future, was threatened. He'd spent years building his empire, and he wasn't going to let anyone tear it down without a fight. But Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She couldn't ignore the gnawing fear in her gut that Carter's return to the ranch was just the beginning. She had already lost so much, her freedom, her sense of self, and now she was afraid that she might lose Miles too. She tried to push the fear away, try to focus on the house they were building, on the life they were starting together, but it lingered. She knew what Carter was capable of, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to change everything. A week later, the storm that had been brewing for days finally broke. Carter Thornton arrived at the ranch with a lawyer and another marshal. The sight of him standing at the gates of Thornton Ranch, the same cold smile on his face, made Eliza's heart sink. She had hoped, briefly, that he would leave, that he would go back to whatever city he had come from and leave them in peace. But she knew better than to believe in false hope. Carter had come for what was his, and he wasn't going to leave without a fight. Eliza had no doubt in her mind that this confrontation would be different from the last. Carter had learned from his previous failure. This time, he wouldn't walk away so easily. Miles met them at the gate, his posture rigid, his face hard with determination. "I'm not selling you a damn thing, Carter," Miles said, his voice cold and unwavering. "You can take your lawyer and your marshal and get off my land." Carter's smile didn't falter. "I don't think you understand, Miles," he said smoothly. "I don't need you to sell. I'll take it from you." His words were laced with malice, but Miles didn't flinch. "You don't get to dictate what happens here," he said, his voice low but powerful. "You'll leave, and you'll leave peacefully, or I'll make sure you don't leave at all." The tension in the air was thick, but neither man moved. Eliza could feel the weight of the moment in her chest, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. She stepped forward, her heart racing in her chest. "Miles," she said softly, "I'm not afraid of him anymore." Miles looked at her, his eyes softening for a moment, but then his gaze hardened again as he turned back to Carter. "This ends now," he said. Carter's smile faltered, and for a moment, Eliza thought he might back down. But then he straightened, his shoulders squared. "You'll regret this, Miles. I'll have what's mine." He turned on his heel, motioning for the marshal and lawyer to follow him, and walked off the property. But his parting words hung in the air, sharp and biting. Eliza watched them leave, her chest tight with anxiety. But something inside her told her this wasn't the end. Carter would be back, but next time, they would be ready. After they left, Eliza stood in the silence that followed, her heart still racing. Miles walked over to her, his eyes soft but full of determination. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "I won't let him take anything from us." Eliza didn't respond, her mind still processing the confrontation. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he could protect them. But a part of her, something deep and buried, was still afraid. She had run from one monster, only to find herself in the middle of another. But this time it was different. Miles wasn't like Charles. Miles was willing to fight for her and for them. As the sun set over the horizon, Eliza stood with him on the porch, the weight of the day lifting slowly from her shoulders. They had faced down one threat, but the war was far from over. And Eliza knew that no matter what happened next, she had found something worth fighting for. Together, they could face anything. 6 months later, house is complete. Moving day, Miles carries Eliza over threshold. Inside, everything is perfect, filled with light and warmth. In the library, Miles hands her a document. It's the deed. The house and 500 acres are in her name alone. Eliza, Miles what? Miles, you're home, so you'll never be trapped again. You own it. Just you. She's overwhelmed with emotion. Eliza, I already have everything I need. Takes his hand, places it on her stomach. She's pregnant. Miles, stunned joy, really? She nods, both crying happy tears. They stand in their home, built from broken pieces. Through window, the old broken wagon visible in garden, now a planter full of flowers. A monument to where they started.